video, we'll be discussing a period in world history known as the Atlantic Revolutions. We've spent quite a bit of time in this course discussing the creation of the Atlantic world. And the Atlantic world is a term given to the economic, cultural, social, demographic, and political connections that existed between Europe, Africa, and the Americas after the Age of Conquest, after the Age of Colony building. So the period from 1492 to 1775 was a period in which Europe established a number of colonies within North and South America. You see the emergence of New Spain, New France. England builds colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. There are colonies throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And Europe benefited from this colonial model. They benefited from the colonial model because the Atlantic world became the center, or the most important global trading network. There was a balance of power, a shift in the balance of power that took place in this age of conquest, in this age of colony building. Traditionally, Europe had been dependent on trade with China, and China really kind of had the upper hand. They benefited the most from those trading networks along the Silk Road. But after the European conquest of the so-called New World, after they established colonies in North and South America, the resulting exchange, economic exchange, which is sometimes called the Columbian Exchange, moved to the forefront of the global economy. It quickly became the most significant trading network in the global economy, shifting the power from China to Europe. The Columbian Exchange introduced new food, it introduced new agricultural products, it also introduced diseases. Diseases were shared between the old world and the new. It brought new ideas and new traditions. Religions were brought from Europe to the New World and enforced somewhat violently at times. It also resulted, the Atlantic world and the Columbian Exchange also resulted in the fundamental transformation of four distinct continents. So Europe would benefit from a shift in the balance of power based on global trade. The Americas would grow in terms of agricultural production. They would grow as markets, they would grow as a source of production. And Africa would be devastated by what's become known as the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade fundamentally changed the histories of North America, South America, and Africa, and set the stage for a number of conflicts that will structure or shape the modern world. So there are a lot of changes taking place between 1492 and 1775. From 1775 to 1821, the Atlantic world moves into a new stage. And that's a stage that's marked by the end of empire. Oftentimes, this end of empire is referred to as the Age of Atlantic Revolutions, because there were a number of revolutions that took place across or within these worlds connected by Atlantic trade. First up, you have the American Revolution. The American Revolution, which is roughly dated from 1775 to 1781, although those dates can be debated. Do you start it with the first violence? Do you start it with the Declaration of Independence? Do you end it with the cessation of violence, or do you end it with the Treaty of Paris? But those are the rough dates for the American Revolution. And it was driven by some long-term problems within the colonial structure, long-term problems within England's hold on its American colonies. This conflict came from a number of different areas. It came from protectionist economics, from the fact that England tended to see its colonies as a resource to exploit. And so they used things like the Navigation Acts to require the colonies trade only with England. Resentment came in the form of various attempts on the part of England to tighten control over their American colonies. These would be things like James II dissolving the New England colonies and creating a great dominion of New England that he could control more tightly. What this all kind of led to was this sense among colonists that maybe England doesn't actually know the best way to govern us from an entire ocean away. This is what the colonists were saying. They were also influenced, the American revolutionaries were also influenced by new ideas from the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is just the name given to a period in the middle of the 18th century in which old ideas were challenged and new ideas emerged. Different ideas came out of the Enlightenment, much like thinkers today, thinkers in the 18th century didn't agree on what the right answer was. But what they did share in common was this idea that you didn't need to just accept the status quo, the way things were, merely because that's the way things were. Instead, you should think rationally. You should apply the laws of reason to religion or to the economy or to society or to government and decide what would be best. And if it's not the old way of doing things, then change the way that you do things. So the Enlightenment thinkers encouraged change and this idea that the world could be made better through the application of reason. Another long-term cause of the American Revolution would be the 7 Years' War, more commonly known as the French and Indian War in American history, which created a tremendous debt burden on England and changed the dynamic in North America by removing the French from their position in New France in North America. By removing France as a threat, the colonists needed less protection from England. So at the same time that England is raising taxes to pay off their debt burden, the colonists believe that they don't really need England as much, English protection as much. And so that ended up snowballing with a series of taxes and tariffs and increasing resistance to protectionist economic policies and a lack of representation. And by 1775, this resentment had snowballed into war. Into what Americans call the American Revolution or their war for independence. Speaking about the broad path of the revolution, it did not go particularly well for Americans at first. And then at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, French involvement helped to turn the tide. And in Yorktown in 1781, you have a final victory. American independence was recognized in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And then these newly independent Americans needed to decide what to do next. How do you formulate a government now that you can make any kind of government that you want? So the consequences of the American Revolution were profound. It resulted in American independence, an end or curtailing of practices of mercantilism. Britain suffered a large loss of their colonial possessions. They didn't lose everything, but they did lose those 13 colonies. And it would inspire other revolutions. Some very profound ramifications or consequences of the American Revolution. One of the other revolutions that the American Revolution would, at least in part, help to inspire happened on the other side of the Atlantic, and it was the French Revolution. The French Revolution, again, the dates are debatable, but is roughly dated from about 1789 to 1804. It was caused by a number of factors, including a debt crisis. France was pretty much bankrupt and in tremendous debt with no way of paying it, no real way of collecting taxes. Society had kind of devolved, if you will, into a situation where the elite had almost all of the power, even though they made up a minor percentage of the population. And there was a growing middle class, what historians call a bourgeoisie, that didn't really fit into the traditional structure. They didn't really have a say in government. So it all kind of snowballs when Louis XVI is trying to raise taxes to pay for some of these debts, to get France out of bankruptcy. And there's enough political pressure put on him that he has to call the French representative body, called the Estates-General. And that's a group that has not met in 175 years. So it convenes in 1789, and prior to that date, it had not met in 175 years. So this is a revolutionary act, and it sparks a political crisis. It sparks the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution is a complicated period in history, and it's the subject of individual classes in many campuses or in many colleges across the country. So what we're going to do is just kind of look at some of the broad patterns and consequences of the French Revolution. One way of thinking about the French Revolution is to see it as a pendulum swing. France started, as you can see here in this image, France started with an absolute monarchy. And in an absolute monarchy, the king can do whatever he wants, can make any decisions, and those decisions are unbounded by law, by representative institution. He's not constrained. So the revolution, the French Revolution, starts as a protest against that kind of power. The earliest phase of the revolution is often referred to as the liberal phase, and the liberal phase results in the creation of a constitutional monarchy. That means that France in 1791 still has a monarchy, but it has to work in conjunction with representative bodies, at this point the National Assembly, and is constrained by the rule of law. In 1792, that dynamic, that sort of liberal dynamic of representative government, changes when France goes to war with most of the rest of Europe to defend itself. The war has a tendency to radicalize politics, creating an us versus them mentality. And it quickly devolved in France into this situation where you're either for us or you're against us. And so that resulted in the 1793 to 1794 Reign of Terror, in which so-called enemies of the revolution were executed by guillotine. In a roughly 10-month period, more than 13,000 so-called enemies of the revolution were executed by guillotine. And by 1794, people were tired of that. So what you see is a reaction. It's called the Thermidorian reaction, but it's a reaction to this reign of terror. And France starts its swing back. So this radical government that existed in 1793 starts to move back towards a more conventional form of government, or a more conservative form of government. The National Convention gives way to a 5-person directory. The 5-person directory gives way to a 3-person consulate. And then the consulate gives way to a single consulate called Napoleon Bonaparte, who then declares himself consul for life, and in 1804 declares himself emperor. And if you think about it, an emperor is not that different from an absolute monarch. So France underwent this pendulum swing from a highly conservative absolute monarchy, in which power rests with a single individual, to a radical form of government in which the working class had all the power, and then back to a conservative monarchy or a conservative empire here. So what was revolutionary about the French Revolution? It didn't change anything, or it didn't change that much in terms of the actual structures of government in France. But what it did change was worldview. While France would move through empire and then a return to monarchy in what's known as the Bourbon Restoration, they would never again tolerate full absolute monarchy. There would still be constraints, whether legal or kind of public relations type constraints on these monarchs. They also introduced a new form of discourse, a new way of talking and thinking about the world, summarized in the slogan of the French Revolution, which was liberty, fraternity, and equality. And then as questions emerged about how these ideas of liberty, fraternity, and equality applied, they spread across the Atlantic back to the French colonies and eventually to the Spanish colonies in the New World, which will be our discussion for the second part of this video. Thank you.